In this module, we're going to look at the calculate phase of Profit Foundations. In this phase, what we're going to do is measure and calculate the current values for all of the levers that we've defined in your business. The reason we're doing this is that we want to create and record a baseline of figures so that we know where we're starting from when we move on to profit growth and we start to apply those 10% wins. But the other reason to do this is that it is another opportunity to spot some gaps in our foundation and feed those into the correcting step so that we can really truly build a solid foundation for growth. If you do complete your profit foundation work and move on to the profit growth course, you'll revisit the calculate step, because after creating your 10% wins, you'll cycle back, and at that point you'll cycle back to calculate to measure your performance with a new set of readings and values against this initial baseline that we're defining right now, and to spot any more gaps that have occurred in the work that you've done implementing those 10% wins. That will all be covered in the profit growth course. But for now, let's step forward with the profit foundation. And what we're going to do is go through each lever in turn. So you're going to refer back to the work you did in Clarify, where you're going to find out what those 7 levers are in your business. And then you're going to record values for each lever. Now, there are 2 approaches to recording these values. And in the first pass, the first time you do this, I suggest that you take the simple approach. And in the simple approach, we are going to just add up the values and provide a single figure. We're not going to do anything else. There could be a more complex approach, and each lever will have a different complex approach. I'll put the detail in each lesson. But an example of making the approach more complex would be to identify and track the information when it's broken down by channel, for example. And channel is something that we've mentioned with regards to the suspects lever, where your traffic or the origin point of your suspects might come from different channels, like different forms of advertising, online, offline, and things like that. The other thing you're going to do in each lever is look for gaps. And those gaps, there'll be more detail about in each lesson, but at the top level, we're going to look for either no measurement being taken or some odd results, things that you weren't quite expecting. These are 2 things that we can feed into the correction step. As I said, each individual lever will require different measurements and different approaches. So there are lessons for each lever, and there are also additional tools, tips, and examples to help you work through. In each of the lessons, you'll see what to measure and how to calculate from those measurements the final result to feed it into the 7 levers calculation. Here are a few tips for calculating the values of each of your levers. The first point is that you should work systematically through each lever in turn. Each lever will need its own approach about what to measure and how to calculate the actual figure that we need to feed into the 7 levers final calculation. So each one of those is covered in a separate lesson, 1 per lever. Now, all the measurements you make will be made based upon your reporting period. That's what you defined in your cadence lesson earlier. And so in your first pass, the first time you run through this and you do your profit foundations, you are going to be measuring figures for the last whole reporting period. However far away that was, it's the only solid figure you can do, because each time we do this, we need to measure 1 set of figures and record them per reporting period. So refer back to whatever you defined in the Set Your Cadence lesson. The first real tip I can give you when calculating values is to start simple. Don't make anything more complicated than it needs to be. We really are just looking for simple figures in our baseline. When you move on to profit growth, possibly the first or second pass through, you might want to make the measurements more complex and more granular. But in the first instance, we're just looking for that baseline. And the other thing which builds on that is that we recommend you start with anonymous data. And by this I mean just count the numbers in each lever. Don't try and connect the levers together. Don't try and make associations or any kind of continuity between the data as it passes through the lever. Specifically, don't try and line up a single customer all the way through that profit journey, because that can be quite difficult and it can really slow you down. On the first pass, as long as you're consistent and you just count in each lever, then everything should work out. Remember, this isn't forensic accounting. We do cover in the individual lessons some examples of simple and complex data and calculations that you can do if you want to try and get a little bit more data, and that will give you a bit more granularity, especially as you move into profit growth and you want to maybe have a more detailed approach to the 10% wins. But at the first pass, we do recommend that you go through and do simple capture and calculation. As you go through, this is also an opportunity to look for gaps, areas where there might be some simple improvement, and when you get to the correction phase, you can make some simple fixes to get some easy wins. And when you're doing calculate, there are some specific types of gaps that will show up. You've already maybe spotted some when you were doing capture, but in calculate, you're going to get two main issues that you might not have spotted before. The first one is where you've got no measurements at all, and that's what we call a blind gap. You're operating on that lever, but you're not measuring the results of what you're doing. So that's a blind. The other one is where you get an odd or unexpected result, possibly because something stopped working or you stopped applying any effort to it. And that's something that we give the label broken. So either of those two things, if they show up, make a note and we will deal with it in the correct phase. And one last thing, we've provided you with a calculate worksheet and a guide on the calculations to make, and there's a separate lesson in here that shows you how to use those. Look out for that.